Ruby Garner had learned to disappear without ever leaving the room, and she had been doing it for so long that she no longer noticed the way she pressed herself into corners, swallowed her opinions whole, and smiled at men who said stupid things as though they had just handed her the moon. The year was 1878, and the town of Caldwell Creek sat at the edge of the Kansas plains like a sun-bleached bone dropped by some passing creature who could not be bothered to carry it any further. It was a proper town if you squinted at it the right way: a general store, a livery stable, a church with a crooked steeple, a saloon that never quite closed, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Elspeth Dunmore, who believed in clean sheets, strong coffee, and absolute silence after 9 in the evening. There was also a land office, a blacksmith, a small schoolhouse, and a doctor who smelled permanently of whiskey and still managed to set broken bones with reasonable accuracy. Caldwell Creek was the kind of place where people had come from somewhere else and had never quite decided whether staying had been worth it. Ruby had been born here, which put her in a smaller category than most. Her father, Thomas Garner, had built the general store from raw lumber and raw ambition back in 1851, and he had died of a fever in 1869, leaving Ruby the store, the small house behind it, and a ledger full of debts she had spent the next 9 years quietly paying off. She was 27 years old now, and she ran the store alone, ordered the supplies alone, repaired the shelves alone, and negotiated prices with supply riders who always assumed at first glance that she would accept whatever number they offered without question. She always accepted the first number, not because she did not know better. She knew perfectly well what flour cost per barrel and what markup she was entitled to, and what the going rate for lamp oil was in 3 neighboring counties. She accepted the first number because arguing made men uncomfortable, and men who were uncomfortable became men who took their business elsewhere, and men who took their business elsewhere left her with a store that could not pay its debts. That was what she told herself. That was the logic she had built her life around, neat and tight as a dovetail joint, and she had lived inside it so long she could no longer see the walls. The people of Caldwell Creek liked Ruby Garner in the easy, unexamined way that people like furniture that does not get in the way. She was helpful. She was quiet. She remembered that Hector Plum had a wife who preferred the softer grade of cotton thread, and that the Morales family at the edge of town always needed an extra week to pay. She extended credit with a grace that made the borrowing feel like a gift. She cut prices when she knew families were struggling and never mentioned it again. She smiled at the mayor when he talked too long about the proposed new road. She nodded at the preacher even when his sermons were aimed specifically at widows and women who lived alone and ran their own affairs. She had learned, with extraordinary precision, exactly how much of herself to offer and how much to keep back so that nobody ever felt threatened by her competence or her intelligence or the fact that she kept better books than any man in the county. It had started with her mother, she supposed, though she rarely examined that particular root of the thing. Her mother, Margaret Garner, had been a woman of opinions, and her opinions had made her father's life a recurring storm. Ruby had watched from the age of 6 the way her father's jaw tightened when her mother spoke plainly about what she thought, and she had drawn from that observation the quiet, devastating conclusion that a woman's plainness of speech was a thing that cost the people she loved their peace of mind. Her mother had died when Ruby was 12, and though she had mourned her genuinely and completely, some part of Ruby had also registered the way the house had grown quieter and easier after that, and she had understood with a child's terrible efficiency what lesson she was meant to take from the difference. So she had made herself quieter, and then quieter still. And then she had discovered that the quieter she became, the more people leaned toward her, relieved and grateful, and she had found something that looked very much like love in that leaning, and she had spent the next 15 years feeding it. Eli Haskins arrived in Caldwell Creek on a Wednesday in early April, which was a good time for arriving anywhere in Kansas because the worst of the winter was gone, and the worst of the summer heat had not yet come, and the plains were briefly, generously green. He rode in on a gray horse named Roscoe, who was old enough to be dignified and stubborn enough to still have opinions about the pace, and he had behind him a pack mule loaded with surveying equipment, tripods and chains and compasses, and a leather satchel full of field notebooks with careful handwriting inside them. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had spent years working outside, with dark brown hair that was a little too long for respectability and gray eyes that had the unsettling quality of looking at you and actually registering what they saw. There was a scar along his left jaw, faded to silver, that he had gotten from a barbed wire fence in his 20s, and that he never bothered explaining unless directly asked. He was a land surveyor contracted by the Kansas Pacific Railway to assess and map the land north of Caldwell Creek, which the railway intended to purchase for a new spur line, and he expected to be in town for approximately 3 months, possibly 4. He came into the general store on his first afternoon because he needed tobacco and coffee beans and a new notebook, his last one having gotten soaked through a river crossing 2 days prior. Ruby was behind the counter tallying a column of figures when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up with the automatic smile she had long since perfected, the one that was warm enough to be welcoming and careful enough not to promise anything. "Good afternoon," she said. "What can I help you with?" He looked around the store first, which most people did not do. Most people came in knowing what they wanted and went directly to where they thought it might be. But Eli Haskins stopped just inside the doorway and actually looked at the shelves, moving his gaze slowly across the organized rows of tins and jars and bolts of fabric and tools and medicine, and everything else Ruby stocked with methodical care. Something in his expression suggested that he was genuinely interested in what he was seeing, not just as a means to what he needed, but as a thing worth noting in itself. "Organized by category and then by frequency of use," he said, more to himself than to her. "That is a sensible system." Ruby blinked. Nobody had ever said that to her before. The organization of her shelves was a matter she had thought through carefully. Heavily used items at eye level toward the front, specialty items arranged logically further back. But it was the sort of thought that happened behind the scenes, invisibly, in the same way that good infrastructure was only noticed when it failed. "Thank you," she said, and caught herself already beginning to diminish it. She had been about to say something like, "It just seemed practical," or "It was not any great effort," and she swallowed both of those things and simply let the thank you stand alone, which felt oddly exposed, like leaving a window open. He came to the counter and told her what he needed, and she moved around the store collecting things with the efficient knowledge of a woman who knew exactly where everything was. And when she set it all on the counter and quoted him the price, he said, "That is fair," and paid it without any of the habitual masculine bargaining she had come to expect from strangers, which she found so startling that she nearly dropped his change. "Are you passing through?" she asked, because it seemed like the appropriate thing to ask. "Staying for a spell," he said. "I am doing survey work north of town. 3 months, maybe more. I will need a place to board. You would not happen to know of one." She told him about Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house and drew him a quick map on the back of a receipt paper, the way she always did for strangers, because the town's only street sign had been knocked down by a runaway wagon 2 years ago and never replaced. "Much obliged," he said, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into his breast pocket. He picked up his supplies and turned toward the door and then stopped and turned back. "I did not catch your name." "Ruby Garner. I own the store." He nodded, as though that confirmed something he had already suspected. "Eli Haskins. I expect I will be in regularly. I go through coffee at a rate my conscience cannot quite defend." He said it with a dry seriousness that made it very clear he was making a small joke, and Ruby felt the corner of her mouth pull up in a genuine way before she could manage it. "I will keep it in stock, Mr. Haskins." "Eli," he said. "Mr. Haskins sounds like my father, and he was a complicated man." He left, and the bell rang above the door, and Ruby stood behind her counter for a moment in the slightly shifted quality of air that follows when something ordinary has happened, and you suspect, without being able to say exactly why, that it was not quite as ordinary as it seemed. He came back Thursday morning for a pound of coffee. He came back Saturday afternoon for a length of rope and a tin of axle grease for his mule. He came back the following Tuesday for a spare compass because his primary one had developed a wobble in the needle, and while Ruby looked through her stock of instruments, she kept a small selection for the supply riders and ranchers who occasionally needed them. He leaned against the counter and asked her how long she had run the store. 9 years, she said, since my father passed, and before that. I worked in it with him from the time I was old enough to make change. He was quiet for a moment, watching her sort through the compass box with familiar hands. You know this place the way most people know their own skin, he said. I mean that as a genuine observation. Ruby felt the familiar pull the instinct to deflect, to say something modest, to round the edges of what he was offering so it did not seem too large and therefore too presumptuous to keep. She set the compass on the counter. I do know it well, she said, and left it at that, and it was slightly harder than it looked. He bought the compass and left, and she noticed, arranging things behind the counter, that he had a way of asking questions that were not quite questions. They were observations offered with a space at the end, an open door she could walk through or not, and there was no pressure in his manner either way. It was a particular quality of attention that she was not accustomed to, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it. The weeks settled into a pattern. Eli worked the land north of town 6 days a week, rising before the sun and returning at dusk with muddy boots and notebooks full of measurements. He ate his supper at Mrs. Dunmore's table with the other boarders, a young telegraph operator named Cal Reese and a traveling medicine seller named Bart Loomis, who believed with evangelical fervor in the curative power of his own product, and demonstrated this by taking it constantly, which did not appear to be working. Eli was polite to both of them and friends with neither, in the comfortable way of a man who had learned that temporary proximity was not the same thing as genuine connection, and had made peace with the distinction. He came into the store 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes he needed something, and sometimes he needed nothing, and bought a small thing anyway, a box of matches, a piece of hard candy, once a small carved wooden horse from the shelf of toys Ruby kept near the front window, which he said was for the daughter of one of the ranch hands who had helped him move equipment across a creek. Ruby believed him because it did not occur to her not to, and also because he did not seem like a man who offered explanations he had not thought about first. He began staying longer. Not long, not in any way that could be called loitering, but he would lean against the counter while she worked and make conversation, and the conversation had a quality she did not often experience, which was that he seemed genuinely interested in her responses. He asked about the town, about its history, about the families she mentioned when she talked about her customers, and he listened to her answers with his full attention, which was more disorienting than it should have been. One afternoon in late April, a man named Gerald Swick came into the store. Gerald Swick was the kind of man who had appointed himself, without anyone's permission, as the town's primary authority on matters he did not actually understand. He was on the town council. He had money enough to be comfortable and not enough to be interesting, and he had a particular habit of coming into Ruby's store and conducting his shopping as though she were a clerk he employed rather than the business owner he was patronizing. He came in while Eli was there, buying coffee again, and he moved through the store with his usual proprietorial energy, picking things up and setting them down without care. And when he brought his selections to the counter, he looked at the price Ruby quoted and said, "No, I think 5 cents less on the lard. I was paying 5 cents less last month." Ruby opened her mouth and the old machinery engaged automatically. She had already begun calculating how much the 5 cents would matter over the course of the year, whether it was worth keeping him friendly, whether refusing would cost her more in the long run, when Eli, without particular heat, said, "Did you bring the receipt from last month?" Gerald Swick looked at him. "I beg your pardon. The receipt showing you paid 5 cents less," Eli said, in the same calm, conversational tone. "If you have it, Miss Garner would presumably honor the price. If you do not have it, I expect you would understand why she might need to charge what she has quoted." There was a silence. Gerald Swick was the kind of man who did not often have someone speak plainly to him, and he was not entirely sure how to receive it. He looked at Eli and then at Ruby and then back at Eli, and some calculation happened behind his eyes that ended with him deciding that the scene was not worth the effort. "The price is fine," he said, and paid it and left. Ruby stood behind her counter and felt something strange moving through her chest, something she could not immediately name. She had watched the whole exchange the way you watch something happen in a dream, with the sensation of being both present in it and removed from it, a spectator at a scene that should by rights have been hers to play. "I could have handled that myself," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. Eli looked at her without any defensiveness. "I know you could have," he said. "Did you intend to?" The question landed with a quiet precision that made her breath catch. She opened her mouth and closed it again. She had not been about to handle it. She had been about to give Gerald Swick his 5 cents off and tell herself the arithmetic justified it, and they both knew it, and the knowing sat between them with a kind of gentle, unsparing honesty that Ruby had not experienced in a very long time. "You did not need to do that," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "But I wanted to." He picked up his coffee. "Not because I thought you were incapable. I want to be clear on that. I just found I did not like watching someone try to make you feel like you did not know your own business." He paused. "That happens to you often, I think." She did not answer, because the honest answer was yes, it does, and it happens to me because I let it. And she was not ready to say either of those things out loud to a man she had known for 3 weeks, even if they were both true. He left, and she spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about the way he had said it, without pity, without condescension, just as a plain observation, offered to her as though she were perfectly capable of deciding what to do with it, which was, she was beginning to realize, exactly how he treated everything he said to her. May came in on a warm wind, and the town shook off its winter quietness with the particular relief of people who had been confined too long. There was a dance at the church hall on the second Saturday, which was an event that Caldwell Creek organized with a seriousness of purpose that suggested the community had decided to have a good time and would not be stopped. The preacher's wife, Martha Doyle, organized the refreshments with military efficiency, and the fiddler, an old Mexican man named Señor Vargas, who had been playing at these events since before most of the current residents had arrived, tuned his instrument in the corner and drank punch that he had improved with something from a flask in his coat pocket. Ruby came because she always came. She wore her good dress, which was dark blue with small white buttons down the front, and she pinned her hair up the way her mother had shown her, and she stood near the refreshment table and helped pour lemonade and talked to the women she knew and smiled at the men who came to get lemonade and made sure that everyone felt welcomed and comfortable and at ease, which was a thing she did so naturally that she was not even conscious of doing it most of the time. She had been doing it so long it had become her texture, the thing she was made of, at least in public. Eli arrived late, which she noticed from across the room, and then told herself she had not noticed. He was wearing a clean shirt, dark brown, and he had made an effort with his hair that had not entirely succeeded. He got a cup of punch and stood near the wall for a while, watching the dancing with the expression of a man who was deciding whether to participate or observe, and then Señor Vargas struck up a reel, and the floor filled with couples, and Eli crossed the room toward the refreshment table. He stopped beside Ruby. "You have been pouring lemonade for 40 minutes, he said. "Someone has to," she said pleasantly. "The preacher's wife looks perfectly capable of taking over for a song." Ruby glanced at Martha Doyle, who was indeed standing right there, and who was, in fact, perfectly capable. There was no real reason for Ruby to be behind this table rather than on the floor. She had been standing here because standing here gave her something to do, a purpose, a reason to be against the wall where she would not have to manage the complicated territory of being among people without a task to anchor her. "I do not mind," she said. "I know you do not mind," Eli said. "That is not the same thing as wanting to be here." She looked at him, and he held out his hand with the simple directness of a man who had considered the offer and found it reasonable. "Dance with me, Ruby." She looked at his hand. She could think of 6 reasons not to, all of them grounded in the same fundamental instinct, the one that said be useful, be small, stand at the edge where you are needed, do not take up space on the floor just for the pleasure of it. She set down the lemonade ladle and took his hand, and Martha Doyle immediately materialized behind the table as though she had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, which she probably had. Eli was not a polished dancer. He was honest about that before they even reached the floor. "I can keep time," he said, "but I make no promises about grace." What he did was hold her with a certainty that was neither possessive nor tentative, his hand steady at her waist, his attention entirely on her. And when he moved with enough confidence that she could follow without having to think about it too hard. And they went around the floor twice, and then 3 times, and then the reel became a waltz and they kept going. And Ruby became gradually aware of a feeling she had not had in a very long time, which was the sensation of simply being somewhere without any need to manage how she was received. "You keep apologizing with your shoulders," Eli said quietly during the waltz. She looked up at him. "What?" "Every time someone comes close, your shoulders come in, like you're trying to take up less room." He said it without criticism, the way he said most things, as a plain observation offered without judgment for her to do with as she chose. "I was not aware I was doing that," she said, which was true and not true simultaneously. She was not consciously aware of it. She was not unaware either. It was the kind of thing she had been doing so long it had fallen below the level of decision. "I know," he said. "That is what made me want to mention it." They danced until Señor Vargas took a longer break than usual to consult his flask, and then they stood together at the edge of the room and talked. Not the careful, maintained conversation Ruby usually had at social events, the kind where she asked people about themselves and directed attention away from herself with practiced skill, but real conversation back and forth, genuine, with opinions. Eli had opinions. He offered them without excessive apology, and when she disagreed with something he said, which she did twice, he received her disagreement with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, as though she had given him something he had been hoping for. "You think the railroad expansion will harm the ranchers north of town," he said of her second disagreement. "Say more," and she did. She said more, clearly and in detail, drawing on the 9 years of watching the economic rhythms of Caldwell Creek and the conversations she had with ranchers and farmers and supply riders, and she said it without softening the edges or watching his face for signs of disapproval and adjusting her argument accordingly. And when she was finished, he nodded in a way that meant he was genuinely thinking about what she had said. "You may be right," he said. "I will think about that when I write my assessment." They walked home in the same direction, her house behind the store, his boarding house 2 streets over, and at the point where their paths diverged he stopped and said, "Thank you for the dance." "You are the one who asked," she said. "I am glad I did." He put his hat back on. He had been carrying it since they left the hall and tipped it at her in a way that was not performative, just respectful. "Good night, Ruby." "Good night, Eli." She went inside and sat at her kitchen table for a while in the dark, not lighting the lamp, and thought about the waltz and the thing he had said about her shoulders and the way he had said, "Say more," as though he genuinely wanted to hear whatever was there. She was not sure what to do with any of it. She had become very good at understanding what people wanted from her. She did not yet know what to do when someone wanted the whole of it. June arrived, and with it the kind of heat that turned the Kansas plains into a shimmer of gold and dust. And the days grew long, and the work grew hard, and Eli came into the store smelling of sun and hard work, and bought coffee, and sometimes stayed to talk and sometimes did not. And the visits had begun to carry a weight that both of them were aware of, and neither of them had yet named. One morning, a supply rider came through with a wagon load of goods, and the usual assumption that Ruby Garner would accept whatever number he wrote on his invoice without argument. His name was Pete Dawson, and he was not a bad man, just a man shaped by the habit of dealing with women who did not push back. He handed her the invoice, and she looked at the number on the flour and the number on the dried goods and the number on the lamp oil, and all three of them were above market price by margins that were not accidental. The old machinery engaged. She began to reach for the agreement, the gracious acceptance, the maintenance of the relationship at the cost of the money she needed. And then she thought of Eli's face during the Gerald Swick incident. Not smug, not triumphant, just the plain steadiness of a man who had decided that watching her diminish herself was not something he was willing to do without at least naming it. She put the invoice back on the counter and looked at Pete Dawson and said, "This flour is priced 8 cents above what I paid last quarter from the same source. The lamp oil is 12 cents high. I would like to discuss those numbers before we proceed." Pete Dawson looked at her with the surprise of a man who has pushed a door his whole life and suddenly finds it pushing back. He tried the usual things. He had his own costs to consider. The roads were bad this season. She was getting quality merchandise. And Ruby listened to all of it and remained where she was, behind her counter, looking at him steadily. And then she said, "I understand your costs. My prices reflect my understanding of the market. These numbers do not. I am prepared to agree to last quarter's rate plus a reasonable adjustment of 4 cents per unit for travel conditions. If that does not work for you, I understand, but I will need to contact the regional supplier directly." There was a long pause, and then Pete Dawson said, "4 cents on the flour, 8 on the lamp oil." "6 on the lamp oil," Ruby said, "and we have a deal." They shook hands. He left. Ruby stood behind her counter, and her heart was beating faster than was strictly warranted by the transaction, which told her something about how long she had been holding herself back from exactly that kind of moment. She told Eli about it that evening, when he came in for rope, because it seemed like the kind of thing she wanted to tell him, and she was tired of talking herself out of things she simply wanted to do. She told it plainly, without dramatizing it, just as it had happened. When she finished, he set his rope on the counter and looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, because he had apparently expected she was capable of it, and it was that absence of surprise that moved her most. "How did it feel?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "Like standing on ground I did not know was there," she said. "That is because it has always been there," he said. "You just were not standing on it." She counted back his change, and he did not leave right away, and they stood on either side of her counter in the long evening light coming through the store's west window, and neither of them said anything for a minute, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that did not need to be filled. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why do you—" She stopped and started again. "You notice things about me that no one else notices, the shoulders and the why." He thought about it, which she appreciated. He was not a man who answered quickly just to answer. "Because I was paying attention," he said finally. "And because what I saw seemed like a waste." "A waste," she repeated. "Of you," he said, and the simplicity of it, the directness of it, landed somewhere beneath her sternum and stayed there. "You are very capable, Ruby, and very intelligent, and you have a way of thinking about things that is worth hearing, and you spend a great deal of energy making sure nobody has to notice that about you." She did not argue with it. She thought about arguing with it. She thought about all the reasons it was more complicated than that, all the ways the strategy had been necessary, all the context he might not fully understand. And then she realized she was doing the thing right now, assembling the softeners, the qualifiers, the explanations that would make the truth more comfortable for a listener who had not in any way indicated he needed comforting. "I do not always know how to stop," she said instead, and the honesty of it felt like putting something down that had been getting heavier for years. "I know," he said. "That is why I keep pointing it out, not to criticize, just so you can see it." She looked at him across the counter in the honey-colored evening light. This man who had ridden into her town with his surveying equipment and his old gray horse, and his way of paying complete attention. And she thought that she was in very serious danger of falling in love with him, and that the thought did not frighten her the way it should have. He came back the next morning without any pretense of needing anything from the store. He simply came in and said, "I was wondering if you had any interest in seeing the land I have been surveying. I will be working near the North Ridge today, and the view from up there is something." He said it directly, without circling around it, without dressing it up in practicality or pretending it was anything other than what it was, which was an invitation. Ruby said yes before the old reflexes had time to construct an objection. She arranged for 15-year-old Nate Holloway, who sometimes helped her in the store, to mind the counter for the afternoon, and she tied on her hat and walked out the front door of her store in the middle of the day for no reason except that she wanted to, and the air outside tasted remarkably clean. They rode north on the road that became a trail that became a suggestion of a path through the tall grass, and Eli pointed out things along the way. The particular way the creek bent around the basalt shelf, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the edge of what had once been a Cheyenne encampment before the removal, which he noted with a quietness that acknowledged what the removal had meant without pretending that it had not happened. He was not a man who predified history. She was learning. He looked at the land with the precise, honest eye of someone whose profession required him to record things as they actually were, and that quality extended to how he saw everything else, including her. The North Ridge was not high enough to be dramatic, but it gave a long view south across the town, the scatter of buildings, the thin line of Main Street, the church steeple catching the afternoon sun, and west across the plains where the grass ran to the horizon in a long, unbroken sweep of green and gold. They stood at the top of it, and the wind came across the flat land and pushed against them warmly, and Ruby took her hat off and let it, because no one was watching. "Tell me something about yourself that you would not usually say," Eli said. She looked at him. "That is a bold request." "I know, I am curious." She thought about it genuinely. What did she not usually say? She kept most of herself in a box with a lid on it, so the choices were numerous. She thought about what she most wanted to say right now, standing on this ridge with the wind in her unpinned hair. "I am tired of being grateful for taking up the minimum amount of space," she said. "I am tired of the arithmetic of it, of calculating how small I need to be so that everyone around me can feel large enough." She had not planned to say that. It came out from below the usual layer, from a place she had not accessed deliberately in years, and once it was in the open she felt simultaneously relieved and terrified, the way you feel when you have said something you cannot take back and you are not yet sure whether that is good or bad. Eli looked at the view for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her. "Good," he said. "Just that. Good." Not a long speech about how she should feel differently, or an observation about what she might do to change things, or advice, or sympathy shaped like pity. Just good, as in, it is good that you said that. It is good that it is out in the air where you can see it. It is good that you know it is there. She laughed, which surprised her, and it was a real laugh, the unguarded kind, and Eli smiled at the sound of it. And that was the moment she understood that she was not in danger of falling in love with him. She had already fallen, and the falling had been so gradual she had not felt it, like water filling a vessel drop by drop until suddenly it is full and you wonder where all the water came from. They rode back as the sun got low and cast their shadows long across the grass, and she did not feel the need to fill the ride with careful conversation, and neither did he, and the comfortable silence was the most intimate thing she had experienced in years. The summer settled around Caldwell Creek with the full weight of a Kansas July, and the days were long and hot, and full of the particular busyness that heat generates in a working town, more people coming through, more supply wagons, the activity of a cattle drive that moved through the edge of the county and left the town briefly louder and richer and then quieter again. Eli continued his surveying and Ruby continued her store, and between those two things they found the time that people who want to find time for each other always find. They walked in the evenings, when the heat had given up a degree or two. They sat on Ruby's back porch after supper. She had begun feeding him sometimes, because cooking for one person had never made full use of what she kept in her kitchen, and it was a practical arrangement, except that practical arrangements do not usually make you feel the way she felt when she heard his boots on her back step at evening. They talked about everything, in the way of people who have discovered that they can. He told her about where he had come from southern Missouri, a farming family, a father who had the kind of narrow, certain vision of how things should be that does not leave much room for children who see them differently, and a mother who had loved them both with a love that had been large enough but not strong enough to push back against the father's gravity. He had left at 19 and put Missouri behind him with the thoroughness of a man closing a door, and he had never quite stopped moving until the railway work had given him enough of a purpose to settle into, if not a place to settle. "Do you miss it?" Ruby asked, one evening on the porch, meaning Missouri, meaning the permanence of a place that is yours from birth. "I miss the idea of it," he said. "The idea of a place that is yours because you were formed there. I do not miss the actual place." He was quiet for a moment. "I think sometimes about what it means to belong somewhere, whether it is about the ground or about the people." "It is the people," Ruby said, and said it with a certainty she did not usually use for her own opinions. "The ground does not care. The people are what make a place a home or a cage." He looked at her. "Which has Caldwell Creek been for you?" She considered that with the honesty she was learning to bring to the things he asked her. "Both," she said. "Sometimes in the same day." He nodded. "That is an honest answer. I am trying to give those more consistently." The look he gave her then was the kind that a person gives when they recognize something, not something new, but something they had suspected and are glad to have confirmed. "I have noticed," he said. "In early August there was trouble at the north end of town. A rancher named Silas McCready had been letting it be understood, loudly and in the saloon, that the railway survey threatened his grazing land, and that if Eli Haskins kept marking boundaries on land that McCready considered informally his, there would be consequences of the non-legal kind. McCready was not a violent man by nature, but he was a frightened one, which in Ruby's experience was more dangerous, and when frightened men made loud proclamations in saloons, the silence around those proclamations tended to mean agreement. She told Eli about it the morning she heard it, because she heard it from Cal Reese, the telegraph operator who boarded at Mrs. Dunmore's, who had heard it directly. She told him plainly and completely, without softening it to protect him from being alarmed, which was the old instinct: manage the information so the other person stays comfortable. She told it the way it was. Eli listened and said, "I appreciate you telling me directly." He was not alarmed exactly, but he was serious. "I will go see McCready myself today, not to argue but to hear him. He has a point. The survey does affect his current grazing patterns, even if the land does not legally belong to him. That does not mean the railway goes away, but it means he deserves to understand what the actual boundaries mean and what his legal options are." He did go see McCready that afternoon, and he spent 3 hours at the man's ranch talking about property law and the history of the land claim, and what the railway's actual intentions were, which were more limited than McCready had assumed. He came back to town with the information that McCready was still unhappy, but had agreed that the surveying could continue without interference, and Ruby had the impression that what had resolved the situation was primarily Eli's willingness to treat McCready's fear as a legitimate thing rather than an obstruction to be managed. "You are good at that," she told him that evening. "At hearing people. You do it too," he said. "You have been doing it for every person in this town for years. You just do not do it for yourself." She was quiet with that for a moment. The evening was warm and the porch was lit by a lamp inside the kitchen that threw a long rectangle of gold through the screen door, and in the distance something was calling in the grass, one of the nighttime insects that Ruby had never bothered to identify by species but had always liked the sound of. "I am working on it," she said. "I know," he said. "I can see it." She looked at him in the lamplight, this man on her porch, and thought about everything she had been for 27 years and everything she was learning she could be, and thought that perhaps those two things were not as far apart as they had seemed, that the person she had been making herself small to protect was still in there, had always been in there, waiting for someone to notice the door and say, "You can come out now," and mean it. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything, and the nighttime insect kept calling in the grass, and the lamp threw its gold light through the screen door, and that was enough. The kissing happened on a Thursday in late August, which was not a particularly romantic day as days go. It was very hot, and there had been an inventory dispute with a supplier that had required 2 hours of correspondence, and Nate Holloway had knocked over a display of canned tomatoes and spent another hour helping stack them, and Ruby had a headache from the heat and the letters and the tomatoes. Eli had come in late in the afternoon for matches and stayed while she finished a column of figures, and when she put down her pen and said, "This day has been a collection of small frustrations," he said, "Tell me about them." And she did, all of them, and he listened to every single one without suggesting she should feel differently about any of them. When she finished, he was standing very close to the counter, closer than he usually stood, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle that turned everything briefly beautiful, and she looked at him with the thought half-formed that she was tired of not saying the things she actually meant, and said, "Eli, I think I am," and he said, "I know," and kissed her carefully and deliberately, the way he did everything. And it was exactly the right amount and the right quality, and she was not even slightly surprised, which told her everything about how long she had been moving toward it. When he stepped back, his eyes were open, and his expression was clear and direct. "I have been thinking about that for considerably longer than is probably my business to say," he said. "How long?" she asked. "Since the first Wednesday," he said. "Since the shelves." She laughed genuinely and reached across the counter and held his face in both her hands, and he put his hands over hers, and it was the most honest thing she had done in years. What followed was not simple, or rather, it was simple in its foundations and complicated in its daily practice, the way most true things are. They were two people with long habits and earned defenses and years of separate patterns, and adjusting those things to include another person required care and attention, and the willingness to say the uncomfortable thing rather than smooth it away. Ruby caught herself performing smallness still, in the subtle ways, in conversations where she deferred to his opinion not because she thought he was right, but because she was afraid of what it looked like when she disagreed, in moments where she minimized her own needs in the calculation of plans, in the automatic apologies that preceded sentences that did not require apology. And each time, Eli noticed. Not always in the moment. Sometimes it was later on the porch or on a walk, but he would say, gently and without blame, "Earlier today you did the thing where you apologized for having an opinion. I want you to know I noticed, and I want you to know I would rather have the opinion than the apology." It was maddening sometimes, in the specific way that being seen clearly by someone who cares for you is maddening, because there is nowhere to hide and no reason to want to, and the combination of those two things dismantles a strategy that has taken a lifetime to build. "I do not know how to stop," she told him plainly one evening in September, sitting at her kitchen table with the supper dishes done and the lamp burning warmly and the first cool breath of autumn coming through the open window. "I know I am doing it, and I understand why I should not, and I still do not always know how not to." He sat across the table and thought about what she had said, giving it the consideration it deserved. "What if," he said slowly, "every time you catch yourself about to make yourself smaller, you asked yourself what you would say if you were not afraid of how it would land?" She looked at him. "And then say that. And then say that," he confirmed. "Not always. You do not owe anyone every raw thought you have. But when you are doing it because you are afraid, rather than because you genuinely choose to be considerate, try to learn the difference." She tried. It was not an overnight renovation. It was more like rebuilding a chimney from the inside, slow, particular, requiring the kind of attention that cannot be rushed. But she tried, and the trying changed something, gradually and then with increasing momentum, like water finding a new channel. She renegotiated the flower price again with Pete Dawson the next time he came through, and got a better number than she had in September. She told the mayor, at a town council meeting she attended as a business owner, that the new road proposal would direct freight traffic away from Main Street, and that the council had not, in her estimation, adequately considered the economic impact on the stores there, including hers. And she said it clearly and with the supporting figures she had prepared, and 3 of the 5 council members nodded in a way that suggested they had not thought of it and were now thinking of it. She told Eli when she thought he was wrong about something, and she told him why, and he received it the way she had come to expect him to receive things he had not expected, with genuine consideration rather than defensive maneuver. They disagreed about the railway and its likely impact on the ranches north of town, as they had from the beginning, and the disagreement remained respectfully open, because neither of them had all the information needed to close it, and they had both learned that it was possible to love someone whose view of a thing was different from your own without either of you having to concede the ground you actually stood on. In October, Eli's survey work was completed. He wrote his assessment, which was thorough and honest, and which included, in a section on economic impact, a note about the concerns of existing ranchers that drew on observations Ruby had made over the summer, which he attributed specifically to her, which she discovered when he showed her the report, and which caused an embarrassing amount of feeling that she managed with varying success. The railway representative who came to review the survey and assessment was a man named Hargrove, from the regional office in Topeka, and he arrived in a good suit, and with the air of a man who was accustomed to having his opinions go unchallenged. He met with Eli, which was expected, and then he asked to meet with Ruby, which was not. Eli had apparently told him that anyone wanting to understand the economic texture of Caldwell Creek needed to talk to the woman who ran the general store, because she knew more about the financial rhythms of the region than anyone else. Hargrove sat across from Ruby in her store after closing, and she told him, clearly and without apology, what she knew about the ranchers, about the freight patterns, about the prices and the debts and the rhythms of money moving through a small western town. She told him what she thought the railway would help and what she thought it would harm, and she offered specific suggestions for the routing of the spur line that would reduce the impact on the grazing land that McCready and his neighbors depended on. Hargrove listened, and when he left he shook her hand and said, "Miss Garner, you have given me more useful information this afternoon than the regional land office has provided in 6 months." She thanked him and meant it, and did not do the thing where she qualified the compliment into nothing. Eli was waiting on the porch when she came around the back of the store. He had heard none of the meeting. He had been out of town while Hargrove was there, returning equipment to the railway depot, and he had come directly to her porch when he got back because he had been doing that for long enough that it was simply where he went. She sat down and told him about Hargrove, and he listened, and his expression was the one she had come to love most, the one that was not surprised but was genuinely glad. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "How did that feel?" She thought about it with the honesty she had been learning. "Like standing on my own ground," she said. "Like knowing where the edges are and that they are mine." He reached over and took her hand and held it without saying anything more, because there was nothing more needed. The question of what came next was one that hovered between them through October without being named. And then one evening in the first week of November, with the cold coming down seriously from the north and a fire lit in Ruby's kitchen for the first time since spring, Eli said, plainly and directly, "I have been thinking about staying." She looked at him. "In Caldwell Creek?" "Yes. The railway assessment is done, and there is additional work being contracted. The land office has been talking to me about ongoing boundary surveys for the county. It would keep me here indefinitely if I wanted it to." He paused. I want to stay here." "Because of the work," she said, not testing him, just being precise. "Because of you," he said. "And the work is a practical reason that makes the other reason viable, but you are the reason." She had known it was coming. She had known it for weeks, in the way you know things that are moving toward you clearly and without deception. And she had spent those weeks examining her own response to the knowing, checking it against everything she understood about herself and her old patterns, making sure that what she felt was not simply the familiar pull of someone noticing her and her habitual gratitude for being seen, but something rooted in something more substantial. It was more substantial. She knew that. She knew the difference now between the version of herself that had accepted the first number and the version of herself that was building something new. And she knew that Eli was not someone she had allowed to love her because it was easier than pushing back. He was someone she had chosen with her eyes open on ground she had claimed herself. "Stay," she said, "please." He looked at her with those gray eyes that registered everything they saw, and what they were seeing now appeared to satisfy them completely. "Ruby Garner," he said, "it would be my genuine honor." He went to Topeka in December to formally accept the county contract and to tie up his professional affairs with the railway, which took 2 weeks that felt longer than they should have, which told Ruby something useful about how accustomed she had become to his presence. He wrote her letters, good letters, direct and warm and specific, the way he was in person, and she wrote him back. And the letters were better than she had expected because she was not performing consideration in them. She was just talking, and it turned out she had a great deal to say when she was not editing herself in advance. He came back on the 20th of December, on Roscoe, who was irritated about the cold, and communicated this through the medium of a deeply surly expression and an unusual reluctance to be unsaddled. Ruby met him at the livery stable because she had seen him coming up the street from her store window and had made the decision to not pretend she had not seen him, which felt like a small but important victory over the old automatic management of impressions. She took Roscoe's bridle while Eli got down, and the horse regarded her with a slightly less surly expression than he was giving Eli, which was how she knew they had come to an understanding over the months. "I know," she said to Roscoe quietly, "but he brought you home, which is the important part." Eli watched this exchange with the expression she loved most. He took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then her mouth, and she leaned into it with none of the holding back that she might have practiced once, because the livery stable had 3 people in it, and she had spent too many years worrying about the opinion of 3 people in a livery stable. Christmas in Caldwell Creek was a modest affair, a church service, a community dinner at the hall, the lighting of a pine tree that had been dragged in from the North Hills with considerable effort by a volunteer party that included Eli, who had apparently volunteered before he fully understood how far the North Hills were. The tree was uneven and shed needles with enthusiasm, but it was decorated with handmade paper chains and a star that the schoolchildren had made from tin, and it looked exactly right for what it was. Ruby stood at the community dinner with Eli beside her and did not stand at the refreshment table. She sat at one of the long tables and ate supper, and talked with her neighbors, and offered her opinions on the proposed road and the coming spring planting and the quality of the fiddle playing, which Senor Vargas had not improved since summer but which retained its fundamental joy, and she did not moderate herself more than genuine courtesy required. Mrs. Elspeth Dunmore, who missed very little, watched from across the table with an expression that Ruby recognized as approval. "You seem well," she said, with the economy of a woman who did not waste words. "I am," Ruby said, and meant it. In January, Eli asked her to marry him. He did it in the store in the morning before it opened, which she thought later was exactly right in her place, in the hours that belonged to her, during the time when she was most completely herself. He had no ring yet, which he acknowledged openly. "I wanted to ask before I had it," he said, "because I did not want you to think the ring was the point." "What is the point?" she asked. "That I want to spend my life with you, as you actually are, not as you have sometimes tried to be for other people's comfort." He said it seriously, with the direct eye contact she had come to expect. "And I want to be with someone who tells me when I am wrong and argues with me about the railway and knows more about the economics of this county than anyone I have ever met. That is specifically what I want." She reached across the counter and took his hands. She thought about all the years of the careful arithmetic of taking up less space, of rounding herself down to a size that would not cast a shadow on anyone else, and she thought about what it had cost, not in any dramatic, catastrophic way, but in the quiet daily currency of unexpressed opinions and swallowed knowledge and the long, slow erosion of standing perpetually at the edges. And she thought about standing on the North Ridge with the wind in her hair and saying, "I am tired of the arithmetic." And the way he had said, "Good," as though she had just given him something he had been hoping for. "Yes," she said. "Eli Haskins, yes." They were married in March, when the plains had gone briefly, blessedly green again, almost exactly a year from the Wednesday he had ridden into town on a stubborn old gray horse and noticed the organization of her shelves. The ceremony was at the church, conducted by the preacher who had a complicated relationship with Ruby's independence but conducted the service with grace regardless. Mrs. Dunmore sat in the front row and wore her good hat. Señor Vargas played something on his fiddle that was not technically a wedding march but was beautiful. Pete Dawson attended, which surprised her. The Morales family came from the edge of town. Nate Holloway, who had grown 4 inches since summer, stood very straight in his good shirt near the door. Ruby wore white, which was perhaps not strictly practical for Kansas in March, and she carried a bunch of early wildflowers that she had gathered herself that morning from the field behind her house. She walked up the aisle under her own determination, because there was no father to give her away and no one she would have asked to play that role, and the walking was easy and clear. And she met Eli at the front of the church, and he was looking at her the way she had come to know, with the full attention that registered everything, that did not miss what was there, and was glad for it. They spoke their vows to each other with the directness of 2 people who had learned in the time they had known each other that precision mattered, that words meant what they said and should therefore be chosen carefully. She promised to tell him the truth and to take up the space that was hers. He promised to pay attention and to keep reminding her when she forgot. Neither of these things were in the standard form of the vows, but the preacher let them pass because they were clearly meant. After the ceremony and the reception at the hall, where Señor Vargas played for 3 hours and only improved with the contents of his flask, and where the community of Caldwell Creek ate and danced and offered their congratulations with the warmth of people who had watched 2 of their own find something good, Ruby and Eli walked home together, to the house behind the store, which was her house that had now become theirs, in the early evening of a March day that was cold and clear and enormous with stars. She stood at the door of her house and looked up at the sky and thought about her mother who had died when she was 12, and her father who had never entirely known what to do with a daughter who thought the way Ruby thought, and the long, careful years of making herself less to keep the peace, and she thought, "Here is the ground, right here, this is it." Eli put his hand at her back, steady and warm. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I wasted some time," she said, "and that it is over now." He opened the door. "Then let us begin the time that is not wasted." They went in, and the door closed behind them, and the stars went on burning above Caldwell Creek, with the magnificent indifference of things that have been doing what they do for longer than human categories of gain and loss. The spring was full. There was the regular business of the store, which was better than it had been. She had renegotiated 3 supply contracts and added a small line of agricultural implements that proved more popular than anyone had anticipated, including Ruby, who had trusted the hunch and acted on it without 6 months of apologetic qualification. Eli's county survey work took him out most days but brought him home every evening, and the evenings were the kind she had not known she was missing, until she had them full of conversation and disagreement and laughter, and the comfortable weight of 2 people who had decided, clearly and without reservation, to be honest with each other. By summer, she was expecting their first child, which she discovered on a Tuesday morning and told Eli that evening without preamble, standing at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood surface, because she needed something to hold onto for reasons she could not entirely explain. He set down what he was doing and looked at her, and the expression that moved across his face was one she had never seen on it before, something vast and completely undefended, like watching a man who is careful about his feelings find that he has feelings too large for caution. "Ruby," he said. "I know," she said. He came around the table and put his arms around her and held her, and she leaned into him and felt, in the specific physical way of something long overdue, the extraordinary rightness of being held by someone who wanted all of her, the opinions and the ledgers and the stubbornness and the competence and the years of careful smallness, and the person who was now, slowly and with effort, learning to be large again. The boy was born in February of 1880. He was dark-haired like his father and had Ruby's particular quality of stillness. The way she went quiet when she was thinking hard about something, which as it turned out was a quality that appeared even in newborn children and expressed itself as a focused, serious attention to whatever was in front of them, currently a blanket and a ceiling beam. They named him Thomas, for Ruby's father, because whatever Thomas Garner had been, he had built a store and a life and left them to her, and that deserved some form of acknowledgement. Ruby held Thomas in the weeks after his birth and felt the renovation completing in her, the last walls of the old structure coming down. Because Thomas needed her genuinely, completely, in the way that only the very new and the very helpless need anything, and the need was not the kind she had been trained to meet her whole life, the kind that required her to be smaller so the needer could feel larger. Thomas needed her to be large. He needed her full presence, her full voice, her full competence and care. He needed her to take up every inch of the space she actually occupied, because that was the space in which he was safe. She fed him and rocked him in the chair by the kitchen window in the long February nights, and she thought about the woman she had been when Eli had ridden into her store on that Wednesday in April, the woman with her shoulders pressed in and her opinions carefully filed away, and she felt something for that woman that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but something between them, recognition, perhaps, understanding. The way you feel about someone who was doing the best they knew how with what they had been given. She had been doing the best she knew, and now she knew more. By the time Thomas was 3 months old, she had reorganized the store's supply system in a way that cut her overhead by 12%, had successfully advocated at the town council for a revision of the freight road proposal that minimized the impact on Main Street, and had begun corresponding with a regional trade association about fair pricing practices that she had developed through her own hard-won experience. None of these things felt extraordinary from the inside. They felt like doing what was hers to do, which was what they were. Eli watched all of this with the specific satisfaction of a man who has seen something clearly and waited for it to prove him right, and has been proved right, and is grateful rather than smug about it. He had his own satisfactions. The county survey work had expanded to include 3 neighboring counties, which meant more time away but also more income, and he had hired 2 young men to assist him, which required him to manage people in a way he found more challenging than he had anticipated. Ruby gave him advice about it, clearly and without apology, and he listened and used it and told her when it worked. They argued sometimes real arguments, the kind that came from two people with genuine opinions and the habit of expressing them. About money, occasionally, and about the pace of expansion for the store, and once about whether Roscoe was too old for the kind of work Eli was still putting him to, which was the most heated disagreement they had because Ruby was right and Eli knew she was right, but felt strongly about the horse's dignity in the matter. Roscoe was eventually retired to a small paddock behind the house, where he spent his days in magnificent peace and communicated his approval of the arrangement through slightly less surly expressions than usual. In 1882, they had a daughter. They named her Clara, and she arrived in late April when the Kansas plains were briefly green, and the air smelled of rain and new grass, and she was loud from the moment she appeared, which Eli observed was probably not going to change, and which Ruby found quietly wonderful, because she intended to raise a daughter who knew how to take up space. Thomas was 2 by then, walking with the decisive intent of a small person who has figured out locomotion and is very enthusiastic about its applications, and he regarded his sister with an initial suspicion that gave way, over the following months, to an absorbing interest. He liked to sit near her and watch her, with the same focused attention that his parents both had. Clara, for her part, seemed to find him useful, which was perhaps the beginning of a lifelong dynamic. The store thrived. Caldwell Creek grew, not dramatically, not the explosive growth of a boom town, but the steady, purposeful growth of a community that has decided to stay. The railway spur that Eli had surveyed was built, following the modified routing that accounted for the rancher's concerns and that Ruby had suggested to Hargrove, and its opening brought new commerce to the town and proved Ruby's economic assessments largely accurate, which she noted in her ledger with the plain satisfaction of a person whose expertise has been publicly validated. Gerald Swick left town in 1882, for reasons that were not entirely clear, but that involved a land speculation gone wrong in the next county, and a general retreat from a place where his authority had been gradually but persistently declining. Ruby did not celebrate this. She was not built for celebrating other people's misfortunes, but she noticed the way the air in the store felt slightly different afterward, and she recognized it as the air of a space that had stopped making room for someone who did not deserve the room. Pete Dawson, the supply rider, became something like a fair business partner over the years. They had negotiated their way to a mutual respect that was grounded in the acknowledgement that she knew her numbers and he needed her business, and whatever she had been to him in the early years, a soft target, an easy mark, she was no longer, and he had adjusted accordingly, and the adjustment had been good for both of them. Mrs. Dunmore retired from the boarding house in 1883 and handed it to Cal Reese, who had never left Caldwell Creek after his telegraph posting had ended, and who had, in the intervening years, fallen in love with and married the blacksmith's daughter and become something of a civic fixture. Mrs. Dunmore moved into a small house 2 streets from Ruby and became, unexpectedly, one of the most consistent presences in Ruby's life, not in the way of a demanding presence, but in the way of a woman who had watched a great deal and had opinions about what she had seen and trusted Ruby to receive them. "You have come into yourself," Mrs. Dunmore said one afternoon, over tea in Ruby's kitchen, with Thomas playing in the yard and Clara asleep in the back room. "It has been something to see." "I had help," Ruby said. "You did the work," Mrs. Dunmore said, which was the kind of thing she said not unkindly, just with the precision of someone who believed in accurate accounting. He pointed at the door. "You opened it." Ruby thought about that for a long time after Mrs. Dunmore went home. It was true, she thought. Eli had seen what was there. He had named it without flinching. He had asked her to stop, gently, consistently, without command, but with the clear expression of someone who found the thing he was watching unnecessary and costly. And she had not known how to stop, not at first, not until he had shown her, not by telling her what to do but by treating her, consistently and without exception, as though the whole of her were worth seeing. The showing had looked like listening. It had looked like saying, "Say more." It had looked like noting the shoulders and the lemonade table and the first invoice number. It had looked like dancing. It had looked like a ridge in the morning light, and the question, "What would you say if you were not afraid of how it lands?" It had looked like loving her as she actually was and trusting her to grow into that, which was not the same thing as loving a version of her that had not yet been achieved. He had loved the existing person and the becoming one simultaneously, without impatience. And she had grown, not into a different person, into herself more fully, more bravely, more without apology. The store was hers in a way it had never been when she had run it from a posture of permanent accommodation. The town was hers. She was on the council now, as of 1883, the first woman to serve in that capacity in Caldwell Creek's history, a fact that some people found alarming and others found obvious and long overdue, and which she took seriously in the way she took all serious things. Thomas and Clara were growing in a house where their mother took up space without apology, which meant they were learning from the earliest age that taking up space was a legitimate thing to do. Eli, she knew, saw all of this with the satisfaction of someone who has watched a thing they believed in prove itself right, and she loved him for it without debt. It was not that he had given her something she did not have before. It was that he had seen what was already there and refused to participate in the long social project of pretending it was smaller than it was. The difference was everything. On a warm evening in June of 1884, 6 years after Eli Haskins had ridden into Caldwell Creek on a stubborn gray horse and noticed the organization of her shelves, Ruby sat on the back porch of the house that had been her father's and was now theirs, watching Thomas, who was 4 now and full of insistent opinions about everything, argue with a stick insect he had found on the fence. Clara was in Eli's lap, already asleep despite being allegedly too old for that, and Eli was watching Thomas with the expression he used for things that delighted him. The plains were green in the last of the summer evening, and the air was warm and smelled of grass and something distant and clean, and above Caldwell Creek the sky was turning the particular deep gold that happened just before dark, when the light was at its most serious and most beautiful. Ruby sat in her chair and felt the full weight of the life in front of her, the children and the man and the store and the town and the work she did in all of them, the work of showing up completely, of not filing herself down to a manageable size, of taking the ground that was hers and standing on it, and it felt simply and enormously like enough. No, more than enough. It felt like a life that was the right size, her size, the size she had always been when no one had been looking. Eli looked over at her the way he did, the full attention of a man who had been paying attention to her for 6 years and had apparently not gotten tired of it. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly so as not to wake Clara. Ruby thought about all the years she had said nothing, or something less than what she meant, or the careful soft thing that would not disturb the air. She thought about the woman at the lemonade table, and the woman on the North Ridge, and the woman who had finally said, "I am tired of the arithmetic." And she thought about the distance between those women and this one, and the road that had gotten her here and who had walked alongside her on it. "That I am happy," she said. "That I am entirely, specifically, and unapologetically happy." She looked at him across the porch in the gold evening light. "And that it is because I stopped being less than I am, and that I could not have done it alone." He held her gaze for a long moment with those gray eyes that had always seen her clearly. "You could have," he said. "But I am very glad you did not have to." Thomas, having concluded his argument with the stick insect to his apparent satisfaction, came running across the porch and launched himself at the nearest available adult, which happened to be Ruby, who caught him with both arms and the full strength of someone who had been taking up space without apology for a few years now, and found it suited her considerably. He smelled of dirt and grass and the particular vivid energy of a small person who has been outdoors all day, and she held him fiercely and completely, without keeping anything in reserve, because there was no arithmetic left that required it. "Mama," Thomas said, his face against her neck. "Yes, love," she said. "The stick insect is named Harold," he said with absolute conviction. "That is a good name," she said. "I know," said Thomas. She looked at Eli over her son's dark head, and he was looking at her with the expression she had come to love most, the one that meant, "I see you, all of you, and what I see is exactly what I wanted." She did not look away because she had spent enough time looking away. She held his gaze and her son and the evening and the whole extraordinary, ordinary fact of her life, and she thought, "This is what it feels like to stand on the ground that is yours." The stars came out above Caldwell Creek one by one in the darkening Kansas sky, and the plains were wide and quiet. And in the porch light of the house behind the general store, Garner Ruby Haskins now, though she had kept Garner in the store's name because it was her father's name and the store was hers, and both things could be true, sat in her chair with her children and her husband and her full, undiminished self, and was at peace. There was nothing left to make smaller. There was only this, the life she had built, on ground she had finally learned to claim, with a man who had loved her into the courage of being exactly what she already was. The evening settled around them warm and complete, and the door of the house stood open behind them, the lamplight spilling out across the porch boards like an invitation, like a welcome, like the most natural thing in the world. It was enough. It was, at last, everything.